This is transparency in data, procurement data. And we've got a number of people here that are going to give a lot of insight. I think you're really going to be treated to some first-hand knowledge. Jason Miller is going to moderate this session. He's the executive editor and reporter with Federal News Radio. I'm sure you all know him. The only station that's focused specifically on the federal government. He helps direct news coverage of the station and works with reporters and focuses mainly on technology and procurement issues, including cybersecurity, e-government, acquisition policies, and programs. So with that, I will leave it to Jason.
And I am Jason Miller, Federal News Radio's executive editor, 1500 AM. Yes, your AM button still works in your car. Please use it. It's lonely. Mine is well worn, and do not forget that it does work. We're going to talk about making better use of procurement data for the next hour or so. My goal is, as I said, is to get you involved in the conversation. I get paid, not very well sometimes, but I get paid to ask great questions, or at least good questions, and I expect you all to ask very good questions. So if you're looking at your iPhone, your Blackberries, I may sit down next to you, or I may not, but that's a threat at least, right? So please participate. This is for you, not for me. I can ask these wonderful people questions all day. So how's this going to work? We're going to do about 3 to 5 minutes. Everybody on the panel will get 3 to 5 minutes, give or take. Then we'll get into your questions. I have the wireless mic. I'm a big fan of Phil Donahue, if you remember Phil Donahue. Yeah, there you go. So I will be walking around with the mic. So please raise your hand, let me know if you have questions. I'm also recording it, so wait for the microphone so I can get you well recorded for my news coverage. With that, let me offer some context to our discussion. The alphabet of acronyms for procurement systems, and there will be a test later. FPDS, NG, IAE, SAM, FAFATA, one of my favorite acronyms in government, the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act. And of course, can we not forget fedbizops.gov. I'm going to go a little soapbox here, if you will. Please put up with me for a half a second. FBO, stuck in the 90s. Raise your hand, come on. I'm sorry if GSA's here. I'm sorry if Chris Wernicker is here. I hate it. It's got to be changed. I was really excited to hear Dan Tangerlini talk about FBO Open as part of one of the Innovation Fellows programs, as a part of one of the new initiatives. He talked about this recently at a Senate Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee. I was internally dancing. It's not a pretty sight to do that internally. So there's a litany of all these databases. That means there's a ton of data that comes from it. In fact, in a Congressional Research Service report from June 2013, 12 procurement databases they listed for the members of Congress. So how do we use this data to make better decisions? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. But let me offer some insight in terms of the data itself. Agencies have been using data to make better decisions. We know that. Remember the President's Management Agenda under the George W. Bush administration, that had a big focus on data. As we moved into the Obama administration, we talked about data-driven analysis. There's a stat section for everybody. ACStat, HR stat, cyber stat, tech stat, portfolio stat. The point is, what's your data? How do you use it? How can you make better decisions with it? But there's also problems with data, and we know that well too. Let me read you this comment from the Government Accountability Office. We continue to find that FPDS data are inaccurate and incomplete. Although we've not fully assessed the extent of reporting errors, we have found sufficient problems to warrant concern about the current reliability of FPDS information. Al, when was that written? Do you remember?
Probably 1991.
2004, actually. But it probably was written in 291. My Google didn't search that far back. So we're still kind of in that area of trouble with data inaccuracy, but it has gotten better, and I'm happy to say that because as someone who goes to FBO way too often, I'm happy to see things have gotten better. Congressional Research Service report from June 2013 says OFPP has really pushed agencies to improve the accuracy in terms of their data, the completeness of their data in FPDS NG. The most recent information available according to CRS says that FPDS NG data has a government-wide 4-year average for completeness was about 98.3% and an accuracy of 94%. So obviously things are better than 91 when Al remembers, 2004 when GAO wrote that stinging comment. But then again, FPDS NG doesn't include all the data, right? Classified data, DoD data is 90 days delayed. So what are you really getting and how can you use that data if there's delays, inaccuracy concerns, and the like? So, despite these shortcomings, it's not all bad news, right? I mean, there's plenty of good news out there. Let me give you an example. Strategic sourcing. When Joe Jordan was over at OFPP, he and I went around quite often around strategic sourcing. But the data is there. Agencies are using it. GSA, OFPP are using it to say, what are we buying, how are we buying it, and can we buy it better? And I think that's a great example of data being used. We heard in the last session about the prices paid portal, about how some of the GWACs are using prices to help agencies really understand what they're buying, how they're buying it. Again, I think those are two great examples. And Treasury, Christina, when I wrote this, I had to let you know I did not write this to brown nose to you because I thought, in all honesty, I was like, oh, look, I wrote about this with Robin East, the Treasury CIO, and I just realized that, hey, you're at Treasury too. But Treasury is doing some actually very cool things. They're using a data warehouse to spot trends and opportunities by combining procurement, HR, financial data, and then running analytics across it to say, okay, how can we better drive decisions? There's a growing push for data, we know that. The administration's openness, transparency initiative, and then of course Congress is getting involved. We can't forget about the Data Act. Karen, that's your cue right there. So with that context in place, let's jump into some discussion points. Karen Pica, you are at OMB, so we're going to lead off with you and talk about transparency, what does it mean, and what's OFPP's role around data transparency and kind of pushing it out.
Okay, so let's see, we talked about 2004, Phil Donahue. I'm going to try to bring you to 2014, recognizing that, as Jason kindly mentioned, some of the systems we have are a little outdated. So for example, with FBO, historically, a lot of you know about FBO. Essentially, it was the computerized version of Commerce Business Daily for anyone who's in the federal government or worked with the federal government that understood what that was. So as part of the GSA modernization effort, they're actually trying to look at all the systems that exist in that environment and say, we just don't want to make another Commerce Business Daily on steroids and new cool technology. We really want to look at how the process of procurement works, how the process of acquisition works to help support the workforce and our vendor partners in better ways. In order to do that, you have to have a strong set of underlying data guidelines, data definitions, and data transfer information. And so for transparency, what we're working at is, I look at it in a couple of ways. One, there's the transparency that every citizen of the United States, every taxpayer needs to have. So when I go home to Michigan and I talk to my family, they want to know what we're spending, why we're spending it, and how we're spending it. That's a different set of questions than for somebody who is trying to do business with the government, looking for opportunities, a federal program manager, contracting officer, or COR who's looking for performance data to understand if the performance is where it is, are we getting the outcomes that we need, is the competition in the right direction? So there's transparency on a large scale, which the administration has been focused on now for several years with Open Government Initiative, Government Accountability and Transparency Board. And then there's the transparency that we need in order to make better business decisions internal to the U.S. government. So all of that is the larger umbrella under which we're working. And our colleagues here from the different agencies, we've got every agency working with us with the data standards. We've got DoD leading the Government Accountability and Transparency Board. Transportation is doing some phenomenal things with what they're doing with their data standards and their systems. And then, of course, Treasury with what we're trying to do to help with USA spending. So, for example, we have created a tremendous amount of availability for data. So we get questions sometimes. Somebody will go to USA Spending who's not familiar with federal procurement, and they'll say, how can we possibly have a contract for $0? How can we possibly have a contract that's negative? Is somebody giving you guys back money? And so we have to then explain that because these are transaction-based systems and the data are displayed in a transaction basis, a modification for $0 means something for you people that are in this room. I tell you what, it doesn't mean anything to my dad, who's a retired school teacher and a farmer. He's like, really? How can you award a contract with no money? What's the point? So part of what we're trying to do, again, with our colleagues here is develop data standards, look at how real people look at the information and data, as well as how the responsible federal officials that are required to make sure there's good stewardship around these data are using it in their everyday decisions. So that's what transparency means to us.
Let me ask one follow-up on that as a moderator privilege. When you talk about data standards, give me a sense of what you're looking at. Can you define data standards a little bit, or am I getting into the next set of speakers?
For what we can do for data standards, for example, there was a legislative requirement that the Office of Management and Budget work to develop contract writing system data standards. And what that means is purchasing requests, receiving reports, invoice standards, and then the standards around the contracts themselves, as well as also a requirement to put together a prices paid portal. So when we say data standards, we mean everything from how you exchange data across systems to also what is the definition of an obligation. And for some of us in the room, it may seem, well, gosh, Karen, that's really intuitive. Why are you even asking that question? If you get a room of people that have grants expertise, financial expertise, and procurement expertise, you will have a very animated conversation around what an obligation is and also what place of performance is. So there's never a dull moment with data standards.
Right, that's the first quote of the day, never a dull moment with data standards. Christina from Treasury, let's talk a little bit about your role at Treasury. You're working very closely, I know, with OFBP on data and data standards, and recently you guys just picked up USAspending.gov in terms of being in charge of it. Tell us about how you guys view transparency in data.
Data transparency is actually a new area of focus for Treasury. The office that I'm actually standing up is a new office. I think this is in line with obviously the trend, and also for Treasury within my Bureau of Fiscal Service, this is in line with one of our strategic goals, which is to promote data transparency and usefulness as a public good. We really believe that as the government financial manager, we are uniquely positioned to help improve transparency and accountability of the financial transactions. And Jason mentioned that we recently assumed program responsibility for USAspending. I'm actually glad that he did not bash USAspending because I'm so used to that everywhere I go to.
I have another soapbox if you want, I can bring it out.
So with USAspending, what we're right now focusing on is to make some impactful improvements within a short term, 6 to 12 months period of time. But at the same time, we have developed a longer term vision of what spending transparency would actually look like. We operating under the guiding principle of architecting for unpredictability, because we cannot predict what questions are going to be asked tomorrow. Every event would result in multiple data calls, and we don't want to design a solution that answers only the questions we know today. We want to design a solution that really is capable of answering questions of tomorrow. So our end-state transparency approach is really to present a 360-degree spending life cycle view for stakeholders, so that you can follow a transaction from the appropriation through allocation, a commitment, award, obligations, and disbursements. So that's really our end-state view of what spending transparency would look like. It is going to be a multi-year effort and also require a lot of collaboration across federal and non-federal community. And we think there's a lot of opportunity in this area for transformation and for partnership with industries. So we're very excited about this opportunity, both the short term, making improvements, and also the longer term vision.
All right, so as another moderator privilege, when you talk about improvements to USAspending, which someone told me just this morning to make sure you guys know it's clear that when you talk about USAspending, there is this idea of obligations, right, versus actual dollars. So can you just help define that a little bit, make sure when we talk about USAspending, it's the obligations, that how much money agencies have obligated toward the contract versus how much they've actually spent. Do I have that right?
Yes. So currently in USAspending, and actually Karen knows a lot about USAspending, so feel free to chime in. Currently USAspending includes obligation data only. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the actual disbursements or expenditure. And that's one of the reasons that we have a longer term vision of having the complete life cycle. Because I recently heard at a Transparency Town Hall someone, talk about an example where a particular public website that has the contractor of the website provided information about the award, and then which is probably in the 100 million area, and then they go to USA Spending that's twice as big, and then the secretary of the agency gave something a different number. And if you understand the federal spending life cycle, you know that the answer to all three of them are accurate, but to the public, it's tremendously confusing, and it calls the federal government's credibility into question. So we want to be able to display that information in a way not only it can educate but also be informative to the public.
All right, very good. I think that was helpful because I think there is a lot of confusion around it, especially when, as reporters, we go look at the contract data and try to catch up on, okay, where are we at with the contract. All right, now we're going to move into the agency-specific. Paul Brubaker, if you don't know Paul, the godfather of Klinger Cohen, is that what you're calling? Don't tell Mr. Klinger or Mr. Cohen that.
No parent stepchild of Klinger.
But Paul's with the Defense Department, the Chief Management Officer's Office, or DCMO, I guess you guys call it. So, Paul, take it away about how DoD is using data transparency.
Yeah, so I mean, I was listening to the conversation up until now, and I keep asking the question, kind of, so what? And it's kind of what we're going through with the department right now. We're looking at the data that we have, and we're asking the question, so what? What is this really telling us? And I'm looking at this from an outcome perspective. What do we? It's not so much what the obligation rates are and the appropriation rates, and not what we spend necessarily, but it's what things cost and what we get for that cost. So what's the outcome that we're trying to produce here? Because data by itself and the data sets that we currently have, frankly, are of limited utility. Now, there are probably ways that we can parse data and look at data differently, but it's really not telling us some of the basic fundamental management questions that we have in the department, particularly as we're trying to drive new levels of performance, new levels of outcomes around core business processes. So as I look at transparency, data transparency, and try to answer that question that's at the end of the panel, what does it get you? As I go around the building and I talk to people, the sense that I get is if we're collecting meaningful data, meaningful metrics, it gets us risk. It gets us risk because people are afraid of exposing data that will give a real comparative set of metrics where they can potentially be benchmarked against other analogous organizations. So as I look at this whole area, data by itself doesn't really get you anything. I think you really need three things. And I look at this much more holistically given the role that I have at the department. I look at it in the context of what are the outcomes that we're trying to produce, and I see three key things that we need. One is we need quality managers and workers, people who really understand how to ask questions of operations. And that implies that we need a certain amount of metrics. So the second thing we need are really good measures, really good indicators. And what data is required to fuel those measures, to inform those measures and inform those decisions that these managers and workers are going to have to make on a daily basis. Because fundamentally, when I look at the data that we have, there's a disconnect. We don't necessarily have things like good cost data, good cycle time data, reliable data. In fact, and how many people here are in industry? How many in government? Okay, so you industry people, this will cause your head to explode when I explain this. But we don't even have, we've got timekeeping systems, and unless you're in a fee-for-service organization, typically you don't have job codes that allow you to track the cost of individuals that are performing, which is, a standard practice that's required by DCAA. Ironically, but we don't follow it ourselves in most organizations, at least at the Defense Department. And that was true when I was in transportation as well. So fundamentally speaking, I think we're coming at the conversation a little bit wrong. I think we're kind of wedded to the context of the as is. What data sets do we currently have, and how do we expose those? What does that really tell us? And I don't think it tells us much, frankly. And I think we need to flip the conversation. So we're flipping it to say, what outcomes are we looking to produce as a government? And do we have the data sets to support the level of activity and decision making that we need in order to drive those and inform those decisions? And by the way, I fundamentally object and reject that whole data-driven decision dialogue. It's not data-driven, it should be data-informed, because so much of what government does is really about people, impacting people, whether it's public policy, whether it's regulation, whether it's programs. It's about people, whether it's about soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, Coast Guardsmen. It's about people. And to take the people element out of it, to imply that all you need is data to drive your decisions is ludicrous. And in some cases, and I know this, you folks in the private sector know this, you make decisions based on intuition and imperfect data. And you have to make those decisions. And to suggest otherwise, I think, is somewhat naive. But at any rate, the bottom line is that data is just one element of the tools that we need for improving the state of management and government. And I just want to put it in context.
So let me throw a curveball at you then. If data is one important element, but it's not the only element, I think that's kind of the point you're getting to, is there's many other factors that you have to consider. If you don't have data, you really don't have anything. So do you disagree then that data is the key element as you bring in all these other pieces around it? There was a curveball, it's not planned.
Yeah, no.
You want to think about it?
Yeah, let me think about that for a bit. But I don't think it's you can't separate it out like that. It really needs to be in the context of a broader ecosystem.
But since we're at an acquisition conference, and I think one of the things that I've heard over the years of covering this is, instead of asking, how do you build something? I need the technology, I need a computer to do X. Well, what are you trying to get out of it? That's the outcome. And I think when we come to requirements definitions, a lot of times where people fall short is the lacking of what that outcome is, and they don't have the data to get there. So I think the data discussion, I think data-driven, I know you want to say data-informed, I'll throw a little penalty flag.
Part of describing that outcome, though, is a recognition that you may not have the data that you need to support a decision to drive to that outcome. So in some cases, and we do a lot of business process reengineering in the department, and you would be shocked, and this gets to the whole business case requirement that was in Clear and Cone. I don't mean to digress here, because I have never learned anything run in my mouth. But I want to hear from other people. But we're playing a big wink game when it comes to business cases in the federal government. Very few processes really understand their end-to-end cost, their cost. What it actually costs to execute. So coming to acquisition, and this is, when I'm looking at the acquisition process, I'm looking at what does it cost us to perform that acquisition? What's the cycle time for that acquisition? How effective is that acquisition process? I hear people saying, oh, we want, good procurements, we want good acquisition. Well, define that. What does that mean? To me, it's are we getting the best bang for the, and do we have a set of measures? So data is important. Do we have a set of measures that we can benchmark against other purchasing organizations inside and outside of government, state and local governments, nonprofits, major corporations? What are the metrics and measures that they use, and how do we benchmark against those? And we're not even having that dialogue. Most organizations are not having that dialogue. And we have to have that dialogue. We have to collect the data sets to support that. So data is wickedly important. But unless you start asking the questions about what it is that you want to do and the outcomes you want to produce, you're not going to get the right data.
Wickedly important, I love the term. Let's go to Pat McNall from FAA. Let's talk about how FAA is looking at data transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, so just to follow on from Paul and data-informed decisions, there's two aspects, I think, to data transparency that agencies that acquisition professionals need to address. One piece of it is how we use data to make better decisions and indeed create the right benchmarks, to benchmark, just as you said, against the private sector and the public sector. And that's one major purpose for which we, at least at the FAA, are indeed using the data. Another aspect, though, that acquisition professionals are perhaps not as used to getting drawn into, but at least in my agency, you certainly will be, so particularly for you in the government, be ready, and for those of you outside, be ready too, because we might have some interesting discussions, which is agencies are sitting on the gold mine, better yet, a platinum mine of data. It is extraordinarily valuable. It is intensely desired by the private sector, which takes the data and sometimes manipulates it, improves it, develops applications for it, and then wants to resell it. Fantastic. One, there's an expense associated with providing this data, right? How do I find the money to do it and keep it open? Sometimes in some of my acquisitions, we've reached deals where we tell the vendors, look, as you develop your applications for this, I get a portion of the proceeds to reduce my cost of the service you're providing to me. Sounds good, right? That vendor is going out and selling markets. Suddenly, I'm getting calls all over the place complaining about their pricing, right? Even if you had no, you posted the data up on the internet, right? People understand this data is coming from the government. I don't like the price I'm being charged. Is that private entity that's developed their application without any direct involvement from you at all, are they selling it at different prices to competitors? You, the government, ought to do something about that. What about the reliability and integrity of that data? People develop their whole businesses around our data. Things like sequestration, hit. I may not be able to keep that data stream going, right? It's not fundamental to my business as a government agency to do that, right? But it is life or death to some private sector businesses that rely on getting that data, right? How do you do that? You put your no warranties and all that kind of stuff out there in disclaimers. How does that flow through? Because it's valuable, I found vendors who, they created backdoors through software patches just to make sure that they could, even if they, rather than going through the process of getting our permission to release the data, they can get it directly. We have hard pipes where people have wired and connected into our systems, right? They cut deals sometimes with local governments and start selling, and I have businesses, again, and local governments dependent on data streams that we didn't know were coming from our systems. It creates a little bit of a cybersecurity headache, right? And when I turn them off, ooh, boy, do I get a lot of really, really, really angry people calls, right? So those are the kinds of things that you have to figure out. Data rights. Our standard data rights clauses that we use in all our government contracts, are they sufficient for this type of purpose, right? I have a number of vendors that take the data, will take it raw, resell it, and then come back and argue to me that I have to buy it from them at full cost, right? Even more fun, I can't provide it to my colleagues at DOD or DHS, God forbid. I have to direct them to the private sector to buy it from them. It's my data to begin. No, we don't have to do that, right? I'm just telling you, these are some of the interesting discussions. Is the data even something that's susceptible of being owned? Not all data is. The government can't get copyrighted, right? So, you know, what do you do with that? How kind of protections look closely, is all I'm saying. These are the kinds of issues we're dealing with and you have to watch out for. Flip side, acquisition data and how we use it. Strategic sourcing, obviously, primary source, making sure you're capturing it. We have found if you have really good data and data analytics tools, you can absolutely achieve great things on strategic sourcing. We've gotten over $156 million out of a $500 million spend just on making sure that we've actually targeted our strategic sourcing with little to no leakage, basically 98% compliance, spending it through there. People actually want to use it. Got to watch out for that. My metrics that I use to monitor my own shop, right? How do I improve the processes? How do I double check and make sure that we're delivering the acquisition outcomes that we're really looking for, not just how to deliver the product or service? Did we get the business case, right? So we do the post-implementation reviews. After we've done our acquisition, to go back and double check, did we actually achieve that business case? Did we get the cost benefit? Those are the kinds of things that we need to use as acquisition professionals as well to drive how we do our business and how we make sure we can make improvements to it.
A couple things stood out to me. One of them was the data rights issue. I'd like to maybe pull on that string a little bit. A quick story. Did a report on a agency that had a system that they had outsourced to a vendor, and they went to get the system back, but didn't write in the fact that they owned the data.
Surprise.
And they had to pay for that data. Now for vendors, that's a fountain money in many ways, but for the government, that's a probably pretty frustrating thing. How do you deal with data rights?
Very, very
Carefully.
So my main point is just that, you have the standard rights and data clause. Okay, good. That's only a starting point. You really have to look carefully at the nature of the data itself. So some areas, one of the most valuable for the agency and for the private sector is the movement of aircraft, right? Lots of people have built applications showing the movement of aircraft, You can go buy the apps and enjoy them. And of course, we're very concerned we have security issues and other even privacy and other issues associated with that we want to filter out. But that's not something that can be owned. In theory, anyone with good binoculars can track the movement of an aircraft, right? So most data rights clauses aren't going to cover it. So we start anew and say, okay, data rights clauses don't cover it, but here's the term and condition I'm going to enter into you. You know, I am going to screen, there's going to be this much delay before you display the movement of that aircraft for this particular set of users versus that set of users. DoD, you get my raw data, right? DHS, you get my raw data, right? Most of the air carriers, you get slightly filtered data, right? General public, you're going to get a bit more filtered data, hopefully. But then again, enforcing it, right? I post it to the internet. It goes to 1 source, 3 source, 25 sources down the road. Is my data still filtered? Do I even have a way to check and make sure that they haven't been able to undo whatever masking or whatever we put in? It's an increasingly fascinating and difficult challenge.
All right, so we heard, you got me? Not yet? 1, 2. I'm going to do the walk across. You good? Yeah, there we go. All right, so you heard a lot of interesting conversation. You heard standards, you heard USA spending, right? We heard, hey, it's not all about the data, it's all about the outcomes and how the data leads there. And then we heard, I thought, a very interesting conversation on data rights. So questions, again, I can ask them all day, but this is about you, about your needs. I can run slowly. There we go. Say slowly. All right, so I want a few questions, raise your hand.
I'm Ray Bain. I appreciate Paul's point on outcome-driven. Data-driven is technically running by a rearview mirror, and I can relate that to World War II. In less than 3 years, we had war on 2 fronts, 4 million people in uniform, and somehow or other, we had 1917, 1918, World War I. For the data, we did it. But we did it, and we did it in less than 4 years. We didn't bring a website up over 4 years already for healthcare. But anyway, I guess my point is, I think data-driven is good if we look at it what it is. It's past, and I guess the only thing, what do we learn from it? And I think simplistically, if we look at Bobby Ojeda, a baseball pitcher for the Dodgers, said, we're working on the basics because basically we're having trouble with the basics. And sometimes I think if we look at just what are we trying to get as opposed to having all this information, maybe it's not information, it's data, but I think I like the point of being outcome-driven and also the people that are involved to make it happen. I guess I'm preaching, but tell me more about the outcome.
Sure. Sure, I can take that. I think, you know, the outcome discussion drives a different dialogue than what we've been having. The dialogue that we've been having is, what do we do with existing data? How do we expose it? How do we generate value? And I have, by the way, no problem whatsoever with private sector monetizing data sets, government data sets. If they can add value to it, amen, more power to them. But we've got to drive some fundamental questions, and I think by focusing on the outcomes, you have to start looking at the structures and the processes that we execute in government, whether it's financial management, whether it's chief human capital officers, whether it's acquisition. And getting to the acquisition process, I think we've got to take some fundamental examination of the process a lot more holistically than we have in the past, because it is complicated. And we have generated a boatload of complexity in the system. Or for those of you who are Lean Six Sigma people, there's tons of MUDA in the system, non-value added activity. And Ray brought up the point, we were having a little sidebar earlier, but he brought up the point that from the beginning of the war to the end was 3 years, 10 months and 10 days, something like that. From start to finish. And I look at, you know, the Empire State Building was built in 13 months, and you can argue whether these are, you know, non sequiturs or not, but the grim reality is we have managed to constipate the system. And if you look at the federal acquisition regulation, which did not exist when John F. Kennedy said, let's do the moonshot, and we were able to accomplish it in 10 years. And sorry, Al, I know this was part of Al's baby. With
I wasn't there then.
No, I know, he didn't birth it, so it's not his fault, so don't beat him up. But if you look at the corresponding agency regulations, and then just how those get translated into practices on a daily basis, and you guys all know this because you write sections L and M and you respond to sections, it is complicated. and abnormally complicated, and that drives costs. And there's so much cost into the system to support the MUDA that nobody's even looking at that. And that's why I'm looking at, okay, so who are the right people to have in decision-making who will ask the right questions, and what are the right measures that we should have in place, because that's going to drive a dialogue and questions that frankly we're starting to get at the department. What is it costing us to execute this acquisition system? How much does it actually cost? And why does it cost so much? And then you start looking at the value chain, you look at critical dependencies and what's driving it, and it is laws, regulations, policies, and practices. And until we start changing that, I think we're just gonna be frustrated. And it's gonna be the classical definition of insanity, right?
Same thing over and over.
Expecting a different result.
All right, Karen.
So if I can, let me take this to probably a simpler perspective, I think, than Paul's got some very complex issues, and I think I'm approaching it from, I won't say quite the simpleton analogy, but I'll try to use that. So one of the things that I think we have to use the data for is to make decisions for the future. So part of what you have to do is, how many times have we remediated the same piece of land from several different agencies? Think it doesn't happen? How many times have we bought the same programming code for the same piece of software? Should we buy it again? Should that piece of land be remediated yet again? So when we're talking about making decisions, there's a piece of it which is retrospective, which is if we don't even know what we bought. I gotta tell you, I scrutinize my personal bills. I know what the cable companies charge me. I don't understand the 40-cent charge I get on my regular cell phone bill because I don't know what it's for, and God forbid I have to pay $10 for a landline just for the dial tone. So if we knew across government how much that was, for example, let's take data. Are we using cell phone minutes in the appropriate manner? So maybe I don't need 800 minutes a month on my cell phone bill. Maybe I only need 100, but I'm sure as heck paying for 800. If we don't have the data that support that decision, could that CIO or that chief administrative officer know how to best use those resources in a different manner? So maybe instead of remediating the piece of land again a fourth time with another agency, if we knew that we had done it 3 times before, especially in this environment where we really need to take a look at how we're spending tax dollars, should we be redoing some of those things? So I think there's very broad issues that Paul is addressing. It's performance-based, it's outcome-based. Part of it is the performance could be we just don't do it again because we've done it 3 times and it didn't work.
And I think part of this, I'm going to turn to Christina for a second. How is USA spending, how's the path that Treasury is going down around USA spending going to try to help some of the questions that I think Karen just brought up and that maybe Paul is also frustrated with?
I agree with Paul on the performance side, but I also think that before you can even benchmark, you have to have the data. The data has to be accessible. You can't even find out, well, forget the fact that we have different definitional program, and I know GAO has issued, many reports about how the government spent, all this money and with, 5 programs of fish or something like that. That we don't have the data to really allow us to even compare what the cost of a program. So there's a lot of room that we have to improve there. And I believe that making these data accessible is the beginning of getting us to more accountable and more efficient and more effective. I don't believe that we should just do transparency for transparency's sake. I believe that there is a value that transparency can bring, not just on making sure that the public understand how the government is spending the money, but it will help inform decision and improve operational efficiency.
And I think that's a key point of when we talk about not just transparency for transparency's sake, but once you put the data out there, then you get all the other eyes. I mean, it's the whole idea of crowdsourcing. And I think that's catching on as a much bigger issue. I remember when we first started talking about crowdsourcing, it was like, oh, another thing they're crowdsourcing. And I think you're seeing some value in it. Other questions? Data transparency, there we go.
Hugo Botticelli. I think one of the unexplored frontiers of acquisition addresses what you're talking about not having the right data, not having access to the right data. Industry has a lot of data on what it sells and can create even more. My perspective is that quite often the government doesn't ask for it. So, what do you think can be done, should be done, in terms of building into the front end of the acquisition process the strategic requirements to get the data you need to drive the intelligence to your outcomes?
Do you have a quick example of what they're not asking for? Something comes to mind?
I think in many cases, what's collected is, for instance, labor rates, as opposed to the effective use of the labor rate, right? And what the actual outcome needs to be. So if you need to know what you're spending to get an outcome, build that data requirement in. Right? So it's typically what's requested is, here's an outcome we want, give us your proposal. But what's not asked for, I believe in many cases, is when you give us the proposal, here's a requirement for the tracking data you also have to provide so we can determine that you're actually doing what you want.
Yeah, a little requirement for managerial cost accounting would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? And frankly, that's one of the things we probably need to be looking at. But there, I want to strike a balance, though, and I've been in both the private sector and the public sector. I think there's some data that the government. I mean, you can feel free to ask the private sector for it, but I don't think necessarily that they should have to produce it. I think we wind up getting too hung up on this front end piece, and not hung up enough on understanding the cost of executing a program and then what those benefits are. I keep hammering on the benefit side of this because we are, what are we spending? What are the obligation rates? We're driving some really odd behavior, particularly like in our department where, obligation rates are something that we manage to as a department. Whoa, I can't even begin to tell you what bad behavior that drives. But it's a big wink, and every federal agency does it. They manage these obligation rates, and what it does, it causes you to lock into programmatic activity early in the fiscal year. It's great if you're a vendor and you just, you can get that approved, but it's not the right metric that you want to manage to. So anyway, I want to be more outcome focused. I mean, digress.
So Pat, let me throw this to you for a second. When we talk about outcome focused, what leads you toward that outcome? I mean, Paul's talked about this a lot, but under FAA, is your outcome planned in the air? Right? People will show up and do the air traffic controlling properly. Talk about from an acquisition perspective.
Yeah, so when we check to see did we deliver the outcomes, right, that we're looking for. Obviously very much depend on the acquisition, but one we were looking at yesterday, right? If this program is successful, it's going to reduce carbon pollution by X number of tons. It's going to improve efficiency and throughput at the following airports by this amount. And it will also reduce fuel burn, which is a benefit greatly to our carriers and directly to passengers, as well as time on the tarmac for anyone who's been either stuck on a plane for a long time waiting out on the tarmac, or who has been stuck in a terminal waiting for a plane to be able to get out there, so we'll be able to more efficiently direct the routes. So those kinds of outcomes we set up front. You were absolutely right in terms of triggering as you do the acquisition. We also very consciously figure out what are those metrics that are going to tell us whether or not we achieved that outcome, and what is the mechanism I'm going to use to collect those metrics. And you really got to decide it way up front when you're starting the procurement and the program up front, or else you'll never figure it out towards the end. And that was, for the last couple of years that we've been doing the review, our first and number one the result was, doggone it, think about what the metric is, how are you going to measure it and achieve it before you start the program.
Karen, let me turn to you for a second as well. One of the things that we've talked a lot about is outcome. Is there, when you talk about data standards and you talk about changing maybe some of the process, how is OPP kind of pushing people toward, hey, ask the right questions up front? And we're not just talking about is it best value, is it LPTA, is it whatever, but how are you doing, how are you using this data to make decisions about what really you want to get out of it?
Wow, there's a lot of questions in there.
There's a lot of questions. Yeah, I'm good at that.
Which one should I tackle first? So I think I also want to go back to the gentleman's question too about vendors providing more data. But first, Jason,
You can take the speaker's privilege.
Oh, all right, cool. So one of the things that I also want to bring up, and we've, I think, alluded to this, is Actually, there's a lot of information the government has as well, and Jason, this kind of goes to your point too. So one of the things that we're noticing, part of the reason that people look at the systems that we have and they say, oh my gosh, the data that are there are really bad. No, you know what? The data that are there are good, but maybe we're not asking the right questions to collect the right data. So people traditionally say, oh, FPDS is awful because it doesn't give you the actual amount spent on this contract line item and what you paid for it. Please show me somewhere, anywhere, in any documentation that the system was developed to do that. So what's happened over time is we're recognizing, this is a very dynamic process and very dynamic approach, we're recognizing that the data that we've been collecting aren't the data that we need to make decisions in the year 2014. And so what do we have to do? Are there other ways to get the data? Are there other pieces of information we should be collecting? Not just data, but information. So that's one piece of it. So we're trying to drive, if you will, we're looking at, for example, the contract writing system standards along the lines of, and I'll stick to procurement, not big A acquisition right now, along the procurement process. So we have different functions that are in the different responsibilities for the procurement lifecycle. So what data are needed at what points? What data would be most useful? What information would be most useful? Where to get that information? So I'm going to go back to the question that was asked. The vendor community has a tremendous amount of data. Is it always the vendor community's responsibility to provide those data to 15 different government agencies? So one of the questions that we have to ask, I think, in this exercise is, are there data already in the federal government space that we're already collecting, that maybe we're collecting once, or collecting 15 times and using once? So in this environment, for example, FAFATA, I'll go back to your favorite one, Jason. In FAFATA, when that was implemented with respect to the requirement for vendors to provide information on executive compensation, if those data were already available on SEC or through IRS, because again, the intent of that collection was to make that information publicly available. If it was already publicly available, don't collect it again. So when we implemented that in contracting, we said, if it's there, don't collect it again. Are there other pieces of information or data that the government is already collecting through other venues that we should be thinking about reusing? That's something to look at. And then I think the question is very germane, which is, look, you guys are asking us to provide a whole lot of data. How are you using it? And really, if I were running the government as a vendor, this is what I'd want to give you. We need to ask those questions and get that information.
Christina?
I want to add to that. So I completely agree with Karen about, there are so many data, maybe we don't need to collect it again. So when I mentioned earlier about the approach, the end-state transparency, we really are looking at solutions so that it is not about building a gigantic system to collect all the data elements again, because we are operating today in a very system-dependent environment. If we, part of a lot of the constraint we have about data is because every time we need to collect some new data, we're going to have to build, make system enhancement. So we really want to move as we kind of build our solution, we want to move away from that to a data-centric environment. We want to be able to, this is where I think the innovation should come through. I mean, Pat and I were just talking about how technology has transformed the way we do things, but we really believe that you can get to a point where data can be somewhat, accessible at the source, so that we don't have to keep building new systems, and then we'll know what data already exists in the different agency or different systems, so we don't have to keep collecting the same data over and over again.
All right, we got a question.
In terms of the source of data, current PTSNG essentially is the government contracting officers enter data over there, people who are working for them. And there's a different approach in terms of the vendor providing that raw data, and different approaches have different levels of accuracy and responsibilities associated with it. My question has to do with what is the optimum mix of government collecting accurate level of data, and also who should pay for it?
What is the optimum mix for government or vendor collected data, and who should pay for it? Well, ultimately, if it's government provided, then the taxpayer pays for it. So who should, that's a different question. So I'll stick to the what is. I think what we're looking to do, and what GSA has right now, is trying to pull all that environment together so that there is one environment into which all the information is reported, whether that comes from a government source or from a vendor source. We're talking procurement data right now. So that you would have that big picture. So the system for award management, that environment is designed to do that. If the question is, if vendors are also using the tool, should there be some type of cost share? I would say the vendors probably already do that through the taxes that they pay as well. So I'm not sure how to address the who should pay for it question, because I think, unless I'm missing something, the information that's required to be collected from the vendors is only because it's in a contract requirement, so it's a government requirement. So in that respect, I think it ultimately resides with the government to end up paying for that collection. And I think we really need to look closely, as Christina had mentioned. Are we getting the right information? Are we collecting it in the right way? And I think it's a little costly, both to the vendor side and the government side, how we're doing it now. So we really need to look at that, because if we're getting all this information and it's not even helping us make the right performance decisions, what are we doing?
I think that's one of the frustrations that I hear from vendors when I talk to them about acquisition of data, is the cost to collect the data. You brought it up, I was just about to ask that question. Is there a way to reduce the cost? Is there an effort underway to say, let's look at all the data that we're collecting everywhere, which is maybe a little wishful thinking, exactly, and glaze over. But is there a way to say what data are we collecting, and is it already being redundant somewhere else, and can we cut it? I mean, is that something that can come through USA spending? Is that a workforce thing? Maybe Tom, not put Tom Sharp on the spot over there, but is that something that GSA could help with? I mean, from your perspective, is there a way to reduce the cost? Because I think vendors, that's the biggest complaint, one of the biggest complaints I hear.
I think it's a key point. One of the things that I know the IAE has done, the Integrated Award Environment through the GSA, has done a lot of outreach with the vendor community as well as grants recipients, people that have to provide the data, to identify how we can actually collect the data better. I think, Jason, to your point, the question is there a way to essentially inventory everything that is required to be reported and take a look if that's in the right way? I think that's a great idea, and I'm writing that one down to take back.
All right, that's my one idea for the day. Come on, more questions. There we go, up front. One back here first.
John, Dobriansky.
Hold on, we gotta wait for my mic, I'm taping it.
Okay.
We're on the radio, kind of, sort of.
On the AM side.
AM, that's the word.
I'm John Dobriansky, and I agree with the precept that we're sitting on a wealth of data. I believe that we could use it better. For instance, and this would be my question and discussion for the panel members, how can we use this data to better show, achieving our mission? For instance, at the FAA, we have some very important air traffic modernization and management programs that are going on, and they are really producing results in terms of 30% better throughput at some of your more high traffic and congested facilities like O'Hare and Atlanta Hartsfield. So how can we use the data that we have to better show the achieving our mission?
Did you stump the panel?
Sounds good. Wait a minute.
I thought that was a good question, but all right, Pat.
So obviously it's a perennial headache, and part of this, frankly, is bad news tends to get a lot more coverage than good news, right? The nature of the game. The reality, and we do find this regularly, we do have a number of very successful acquisition programs. We've done some of our reviews. We found a 15-to-1 benefit range, and it's like, yeah, say, anyone care? Right? We posted two things that we're doing. One is meeting with our external stakeholders, those who benefit directly or perceive themselves at least as benefiting mostly directly from agencies. Passengers, air carriers, cargo operators, etc. To discuss with them what are the metrics that really make a difference to you in your operation, right? And then and with Congress as well, and with OMB. These are the metrics that really will make a difference if we can move these dials that makes a change. Okay, how are we going to collect them? How are we going to share them? How are we going to post them? And we do. We post them publicly. It's on the internet. So we do that kind of work. It is still, quite frankly, the good news just tends to not always be picked up, right? As much as I was flying the other day, and doggone it, I stayed in the terminal for 2 hours, and it's the anecdotes. that will kill you, because you're trying to get that news out there.
I'm not entirely convinced all that data exists.
Well, the meaning of it, right?
But yeah, I mean, I think there's some good data there, and I think there's some effectiveness and efficiency data that exists. But I don't think there's nearly enough. And I do think that we spend a lot of time collecting data that doesn't meet necessarily the so what test, but it's either mandated or somebody had an idea that we needed this data point several years ago, and we spent a lot of time and energy collecting that stuff. You know, again, I think we need to take almost a dispassionate step back and figure out truly what are the data sets that we need to convey what it is that we do well, where we need attention, where there are gaps. Because again, I mean, the data transfer, I have a conversation on data transparency every single day in the department. And I hear one of two things all the time. One is there's a concern about the risk of exposing no kidding management data. And then the other thing I always hear is, hey, thanks for your help, but you don't know my business as well as I do, so I don't think you can be of any help. So there's that insular thing here. And again, it translates into, do we have the meaningful data sets that we need to really drive informed decision making?
Well, I'm sorry, Christina, let me just jump in.
Yeah.
How do you figure that out? How do you know if you have the meaningful data sets? Because, as you said, there's a lot of, doesn't meet the so what factor.
Yeah, so, so just, you know, an observation. When I talk to managers in the department and I look at their private sector counterparts, they're managing very different sets of metrics. And in some cases, we aren't really managing the metrics at all. We've got a program that's been funded, we're out, we're making sure that we hire, we're overseeing the contractor, but the skill sets around the back end of that, the outcomes, and driving, you know, alignment and just basic management 101 stuff doesn't seem to exist. And there are analogous processes that we're managing in the department where I don't see a level of what I would call intellectual curiosity to figure out what similar analogous organizations are doing in the private sector, nonprofit, or state and local. Folks are in an echo chamber right now, and they're not sticking their head up to look around and see what metrics are being used, what data sets are being used, what data tools and analytics are being used to inform decisions in leading organizations. And I'm not sure, you know, fundamentally some of the precepts don't seem to be that valuable in terms of like rolling up all the data across the government enterprise so that we can get this look. I'm always asking the question, where's the accountability? How do we drive accountability, and where are we optimizing performance? Should we be optimizing performance at some business unit level where you can hold people accountable for results? And what does it get us to roll up this enterprise, this macro government-wide enterprise? Because there's such a thing as this economy of scale. You really can't manage a massive, massive size because there's no single individual responsible for pulling the levers.
All right, Christina, I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think to measure government performance is definitely a very complex thing, because unlike private sector, you know, which is profit driven, everybody look at performance the same way. You can pick up, it doesn't matter which industry you pick up the financial statement, you can tell how well they're doing from a profit driven perspective. For government, because it's mission focused, and every agency have different mission, to measure that is very challenging. Also, to measure it in a way that the public and the key stakeholders understand is also very challenging, because we don't have a standard way of looking at performance in programs. And so I do believe that transparency can help with that. But obviously, people will pick up the negative news more, and I think transparency is going to be like a culture shifting thing, because naturally, we probably are not naturally inclined to want to share all of our data. But I would say that the other side of the argument is that, you know, if you make the data available, I've heard that, you know, people will figure out a way to do something with it, like Pat mentioned about the app. So I think there are pros and cons, and I think that the trend and the potential is so great that we kind of really have to take some risks to move down that path.
Here, you had Paul jumping out of his seat.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I get what you're saying relative to the fact that government isn't profit-driven and therefore we shouldn't manage efficiency and effectiveness, but I view that as nonsense. And I don't mean that, please don't take that personally. I just hear this excuse constantly about government is not profit-driven, so therefore we don't measure this stuff, we're mission-driven. But, you know, hey, every company has a mission. Every company is mission-driven. They happen to make a profit. Nonprofits are mission-driven. They happen to break even. State and local governments are mission-driven. They've got programs, and they don't expect to make money on them, but they expect to get some return for the investment that they're making. And there are ways to measure this, and it drives me nuts because I constantly hear this excuse that government isn't profit-driven, therefore we're not going to take the time to really take a step back and drive metrics that matter. And I just find that off.
I definitely am not taking it personally, but I don't think that's what I said.
Okay.
I said that there's no standard way of measuring it, and to be able to come up with a measurement that is effective and meaningful and relevant is challenging.
Well, yeah, it's challenging. It takes talent.
And I really do believe that in order to get to the point where we can really measure performance, is gonna be through transparency. Because if everybody's looking at it, you're gonna get your act together for sure.
Only if you're exposing the right data. I mean, you know, as I look at this, if we're throwing out the data sets that we currently have, unless it's meaningful management data, which I'm not entirely convinced we're collecting, you know, it's really hard for people for that Hawthorne effect to take place. You know, and fundamentally too. And I come back to these three areas. I come back to where we need people, where we need good metrics, and that drives the data. That we have to be thinking about that holistically. I think fundamentally we're suffering from a lack of really good managers who understand data, who understand metrics, who understand measurement. And that would drive a dialogue that is so different than the one we have. The one we have right now is, how do I protect my fief? How do I protect what I do on a daily basis? How do I protect all the people that work for me and all my contractors that may or may not be supporting an efficient and effective process? Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on this, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right. We have a question back here first. I know there's no seat. Tim, you're up front. Hold on. You've been waiting patiently.
So, what do you see as barriers to doing more value-based or outcome-based procurement where the contractor gets paid on basically results of either cost savings achieved or a capability developed to a certain service level or overall performance at a certain service level on a vehicle or program, and that's how they're compensated for?
Two things. One, people who understand that from a management perspective on the government side, and secondly, the systems. You might remember share and savings. Share and savings fell apart because we don't collect cost data, and we couldn't agree on baseline cost data for programs and how to isolate them. And again, it boils down to the people, you know, the skill sets that we've got at the table who are managing these programs, and the fact, and whether or not they understand these modern methods of management. And then, you know, establishing the right metrics and ensuring that the systems support the collection of data that allow you to achieve those measures. That stuff doesn't exist holistically. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's just that so I would disagree in part.
Okay.
Only yeah.
Not personal.
Again, not personal, but only we have some very successful performance-based contracts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no, we do. I mean, we've achieved great cost savings. We understand what it requires. We understand how to drive it, how to write it, how to execute it. In fact, speaking for the agency, most of our performance-based service contracts are working exactly as planned.
You're exempt from the FAR, right?
Absolutely. So, not to highlight too much, but I do absolutely agree with you. One of the headaches is the tendency to overreact and say, when you legislate, make sure that mistake is never made again. Right? So one of the things we do require is a business case before we add anything into our policy. You have to show that whatever process we're adding is actually going to drive more benefit than cost. So, absolutely agree with you there. Flip side, I think one thing you have to be careful when you're dealing with government agencies, major government programs, and the private sector to get those kinds of performance-based outcomes is there are so many factors that can go into an outcome that sometimes you do your best to figure them out. If you have a relatively isolated system or a service for the agency, absolutely possible. When it's driven by a multitude of factors, and I hate to use one like fuel burn, right? What's the condition of the engine? Individual pilots fly a little differently, right? How much can I attribute, therefore, my fuel savings burns to the program I just put out there? Versus, okay, these were the pilots, these were the aircraft types, these were the condition of the engines, this was the weather condition, which way was the wind blowing, right? How strong was the wind blowing? All of that, in theory, has to be taken into account in order to be able to isolate, ideally, what was the causal factor and was I achieving that? When I try to deliver good metrics on a performance-based contract, and I hate to use one, but it's very much important, training, right? I will pay you for each fully trained controller once they get fully certified at a site. Sounds easy. Except that I provide, as the federal government, the on-the-job training that accounts for 75% of that cost and time factor. Well, wait a minute. that metric's no longer looking so good as obvious as it seemed to begin with, right? Do I control the recruiting? Does the contractor control the recruiting, the testing up front? Things like that can make what seems like a simple and obvious thing really, really difficult. So you need to know what you're doing it on, I guess I'd say, and being able to isolate the factors to be able to do it successfully.
So are we coming back to performance-based contracting? Is there a new push for that? Because now you have a little bit more data, you know what the performance could be, should be.
It never went away, if you're asking if it's going to be new.
Oh, I think it went away. Just like LPTA, we never went there. Oh, did I say that out loud? Sorry.
Do you really want me to answer this?
No, yes,
So I think the performance-based outcomes, I think, to go back to the question of why we're not doing more of that, I think it's hard. And when I mean hard, what I mean is you have to have people that really understand how to write outcome-based performance measures. And it's not, so when we say, what are we doing in the procurement, it's what are we doing in the broad acquisition cycle in this. So if I have a program manager that isn't quite certain what they want, what are they going to do? They're going to recycle something that happened before, which is kind of an older way to do it. So I think there's a tremendous challenge in performance-based acquisition because it involves performance, and I don't think we have necessarily the right focus or the right skills to write really good measurable outcomes that will give us information about what the performance is. And I think that's evidenced in the fact that the Hill keeps giving us new GIPRA modernization legislation that basically says, you can't even tell us what a program is, you can't define it, you can't tell us how much you're spending on it, and you can't tell us what the outcomes are. So I would say that we may not have the data, but I'm not sure if we know what we're looking for.
Paul feels like it's just deja vu all over again.
I think I started the conversation.
So you guys need outcomes. Well, we have a question here, right? We still have a question. Next. But then we answered it, maybe.
So, Paul, earlier you said there were three things that were really important. One was quality managers, really good measures, but I didn't get the third one.
Oh, the right data. Right data, yeah.
That was easy. All right, more questions. Come on, this was a fascinating conversation. They almost, oh, there you go, in the back, sorry.
I have a question about in terms of the disintegration of data integrity. We talk about transparency and data, and yeah, that's good. Contractors want to know this, public wants to know that, and we all want to know something from one another, but after a while, we have all these systems. We're putting information in and putting information in. And I kind of feel that our data is disintegrating, and yeah, we can come up with metrics, and yeah, we can come up with some kind of analysis, but how do you feel in terms of the analysis if the actual accuracy of that data that you're creating that analysis from is not necessarily where we think it really is?
So if I go back to the 2004 GAO report.
I just found that on the web.
So it's I think it's a very germane point, very astute, and I think that the real challenge is that data don't last very long. I mean, so we have a lot of historical information about what we've done. The question then becomes, at what point do you stop considering those data in the decision? So for example, when you start looking at prices that are paid, how fast does the market change for certain products in what you're paying for. So if I buy a laptop now, you know, that when I bought my first laptop, it had 4 gig. Now we're up to what, 700, 800 a terabyte in a laptop, and I'm paying less than I was the first time. So I think it's a very critical point. And now it's different for different pieces of information. So you have companies that switch owners. How fast does that happen? Historically, how long do you need to look at that? Are you supposed to look at that longer than just the most recent owner? It's different for price, it's different for things. So for each set of data, it may be a little bit different, and certainly for performance information, once we do finally get some, I think those are key questions. So I don't think it lasts as long as we think it does.
I think data integrity is one of the key foundation for, transparency, or even, informed decision, because if you don't have the right data or correct data, or the data with the right context, then you cannot make informed decision. I think the way to really, one thing we're trying to figure out is how to access data at the source so that you can ensure improved data integrity.
So this kind of ties back to the conversation from the panel earlier this morning about the pricing data and then the complexity of pricing data, and that goes back to the prices paid portal a little bit. I think data integrity is something that OFPP has been working on for years. I mean, do you feel like, Karen, that the GAO report, the CRS report that I quoted saying things are getting better, are you seeing that when you work with agencies that they feel better about their data? Or is it the type of thing where it's such an incremental improvement that it's really the times when you see that data is better?
So I think the data that we're looking at is better.
Goes back
right? So it goes back to what you're looking at. So for example, what we have now is every year agencies have to do an independent validation verification. They just have to look at contract files, then look what's in the federal procurement data system. So you're analyzing those pieces of information. As I said, this is a dynamic process. What's happening now is we're comfortable with certain data elements being okay and the quality of those data elements being where we need it, like an obligation amount, et cetera. But we're noticing now that we're not paying attention to other pieces of data that are becoming more important. So I am here to say that I think the agencies are doing a phenomenal job in what we've asked them to do in addressing the procurement data. I think now the question is, are there other pieces, like for anyone who's looked at the systems, if you look at the description field, there's a lot of variation in that. Is it a quality issue? Is it a time issue? So I think we're good with what we have, but there's improvements to be made in things that we hadn't been looking at before.
Anything come to mind of a perfect example of one that maybe something that agencies need to start looking at in terms of the quality and the accuracy and the timeliness? Anything come to mind off of that?
So I think we are always interested in improving past performance information. And
a whole different discussion. Oh, wow.
Well, and then at least if we're sticking to FBS data, I think.
All right, I know we're almost toward the end. More questions? I can give everyone. Oh, in the back. Sorry, I walked away from you. Sorry. You just want me to get more exercise before lunch.
I just have a quick question. So it sounds like there's a lot of data out there. There's data that's being provided by agencies. There's data that's being provided by the private industry. There's a lot of data. But I don't think that the folks who are in these government agencies, such as myself, know where to go all the time. And we spend a great deal of time trying to figure it out. It would be more efficient if there was one place where we could go, even if it had just links for certain types of data that would be very useful in helping us to do what we do in acquisitions. Do you think about some things like that going forward?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree, and I don't necessarily know where that one place is yet. A lot of what we're doing is going to ride on what GSA is doing with the integrated reward environment, because that environment is not going to be what you guys see it as now, this compendium of systems. It's going to be a whole new way to look at things. There's also other things that GSA has underway with how we look at data. So your point's well taken. Originally, acquisition.gov was intended to be that. It's not. So no, there is no one place. Your point's well taken. We're working on it, and I don't have an answer for us.
Is it an initiative now owned at ONB to solve that? I mean, this is more of a data mining problem. The data's been collected in umpteen numbers of locations. We can't see the leaf. We can see the forest, we can't see the leaf. We don't know where the leaf is. And so there's acquisition data, there's financials data. The acquisition people don't get to see the financial data, the financial people don't see the acquisition data. The answer lies when you combine the two, maybe. And so is there an initiative or a program to actually come up. Like recently, one of the companies announced that they're going to work to map the brain cancer genome. And that's going to collect the data from every system that's out there that have already done parts of that and get them to the end goal much quicker. Is that an initiative that is being discussed now, and at what level would that be?
It is, and I'll tell you, I'll get there with the brain before we'll get there with our data. And that was not for the record, Jason. So there are multiple issues. Under the Government Accountability Transparency Board, that group is looking broadly at financial grants, loans, performance data, and how we make that and connect all that. I think you see that as part of the government modernization, is how you're assessing programs. What Christina is talking about in terms of some of the information, if you have a contract ID, you need to carry it to the financial system to be able to trace that all the way through. There are efforts underway, I think, painting a big umbrella under how fast that will be done. There's different channels being worked, but yes, there is an effort now to look at broadly across under the Government Accountability Transparency Board.
All right, I'm getting the hook, so I'm going to give the panelists one last go around, and we'll start with Karen on this side, so I'm going to go to Pat. This whole discussion was about data transparency, making, I hate the word leveraging, I'm not sure what that really means, but leveraging data to make better decisions, to create better outcomes. I'll use the word for Paul. Just give something to take away. What can this group of industry industry and government employees take away? What's the best practice? Give them something to walk away with beyond the fact that Paul hates the word data.
Data, but not data-informed decisions.
Data informed.
Right, it's twofold, right? One is keep in mind, both as vendors and as acquisition professionals, you have data within your agency that is highly valuable and you need to treat it as such. And that includes some changes to maybe how you're doing acquisitions. Two, the issue is how you can best use that data that is specific to your business operation to improve how we do acquisitions. That is a significant piece that we're doing, and it's highly valuable. We're finding it valuable. It's a pain in the neck, but it's valuable.
I would just say, get curious and question assumptions. Get really curious. If I were king for a day, I would mandate that everybody in this room watches at least 2 TED Talks a week, and probably spends a little time comparing and contrasting in the morning. I do this almost every morning, where I listen to
Federal News Radio,
CNBC, and then I listen to Tom and Emily
on the Federal Drives, 1500 AM.
And 1500 AM. And every morning.
I'm not a self-promoter, no.
And sometimes I hear Jason on there, which is always a treat. So anyway, not to really suck up here, but it's a core competency. Anyway, I would just say, getting our heads above the gopher hole would really be helpful here. And yeah, it's dangerous because, people are out there playing whack-a-mole all the time. But if we can stick our heads up and look around and look at how analogous organizations and people responsible for analogous processes and systems and missions are measuring and monitoring and using data, I think it'll tell us a lot about how we can apply that to ourselves.
All right, Christina?
I think this is a great opportunity. I think to unleash the value of the data is going to require really public and private working together, because the government doesn't have all the solutions. I think that if there are solutions that are out there, innovation to think about making these data accessible without depending on system, I really want to hear about it.
All right, Karen, you get the last word.
I think context is important. If you're on the government side, please make sure you understand that if you want good data the next time you go into the system, you have to be able to put those data in. And I think if you're on the vendor side, I would ask, please get involved. And what I mean by that is, it surprises me sometimes when we put out FAR cases or regulations for comment and you get one comment on a regulation. I have to think there's a little bit more interest, particularly with some of the cost around this. Don't be shy about saying, look, we already provide these data over here. Why are you asking for them here?
All right, there's evaluation sheets on your seats, or there was at one time. Please fill them out. If you don't fill them out here, fill them out later, take them to the registration desk. Please give the panel a big thank you, round of applause.